In the early 1930s, Harlem wasn't just a place on the map. It was a world of its own, a place where jazz poured out of doorways, where dreams lived side by side with hunger, and where respect could mean the difference between life and death. And at the center of that world stood one man whose name carried more weight than law or money, Bumpy Johnson. Say his name in Harlem, and doors opened. Say it the wrong way, and doors closed forever. But this story isn't just about Bumpy. It's about a mistake someone made when they forgot who truly ruled beside him. Bumpy Johnson was feared, admired, and respected. He was known as a thinker, a reader of philosophy, a man who believed power wasn't just in fists or knives, but in control. He fed people when the government didn't. He protected Harlem from outsiders who wanted to exploit it. To many, he was a king. But even kings have weaknesses, and Bumpy's weakness came dressed in silk, perfume, and confidence. Her name was Helen, a white, wealthy writer from downtown Manhattan, who thought Harlem was an exciting playground and Bumpy Johnson was her most thrilling attraction. Helen was like the others who visited Harlem for a night of music and danger. She wanted more. She wanted access. She wanted to feel powerful by standing next to the most dangerous man in the room. And Bumpy, drawn to her sharp mind and bold personality, let her get close. Too close. What started as private meetings slowly became public appearances. Jazz clubs, parties, expensive tables where everyone could see them together. And Harlem noticed. Harlem always notices. What Helen didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson did not stand alone. Beside him, quietly and firmly, was his wife, Mame Johnson. She wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy. But in Harlem, her name carried its own kind of fear. Mame knew the streets, the rules, and the cost of disrespect. She held her head high and kept her silence, even as whispers spread through beauty shops and barber shops. A silence that
the pieces are in motion.
Weakness. Helen certainly did.
Your move.
She believed education made her superior. She believed her skin color made her untouchable. She believed Bumpy's attention meant protection. And slowly, she began to cross lines that should never be crossed. Showing up where she didn't belong. Sitting where she wasn't invited. Acting like she had replaced someone who had built that empire brick by brick. The night everything changed wasn't in a dark alley or a smoky back room. It was in a bright ballroom filled with powerful people, expensive dresses, and polite smiles hiding sharp intentions. When Helen decided to open her mouth and make a joke at the wrong person's expense, she thought she was being clever. She thought she was proving her place. But in Harlem, disrespect is never just a joke. And Mame Johnson didn't raise her voice. She didn't cause a scene. She leaned in and whispered. What she said would end an affair, shift power, and remind everyone watching that some mistakes can't be undone. And Helen was about to learn, instantly, that some queens don't need a crown to destroy you. Helen felt at the moment Mame leaned in. Not fear exactly, but something colder. Something that didn't belong in ballrooms or polite conversation. It stayed with her long after the music picked up again, and the crowd pretended nothing had happened. Helen smiled, laughed, even raised her glass as if she'd won the exchange. But inside, her confidence had cracked. She told herself it was nothing, just a gangster's wife trying to protect her pride. Still, the whisper replayed in her mind over and over, growing heavier with each replay. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand how Harlem worked back then. Harlem wasn't run by signs or titles. It was run by memory, by who owed who, by who showed respect and who didn't. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than anyone. He knew that power only lasted as long as people believed in it, and belief could disappear the moment disrespect went unanswered. That night at the gala, people weren't watching Helen. They were watching Bumpy, waiting to see which side he would choose. Bumpy didn't say a word as he left with Mame, but silence was his loudest message. Still, the damage had already been done. Word traveled fast. By morning, everyone knew something had shifted. Some said Bumpy had finally lost control. Others said he was being tested. And in Harlem, when a king is tested, the streets hold their breath. Helen tried to ignore the tension. Back downtown, surrounded by marble floors and polite editors, Harlem felt far away again. Safe, she reminded herself who she was. A writer, a woman with connections. someone who could expose men like Bumpy Johnson with a few well-chosen words. She sat at her desk, fingers hovering over the typewriter, thinking about the story she could tell, the secret she knew, the power she thought she held. But the words wouldn't come. Every sentence felt dangerous. Every thought circled back to Mame's calm eyes and that quiet certainty in her voice. Helen had written about dangerous men before. She'd never written about their wives. And something told her that line mattered more than she wanted to admit. Meanwhile, Harlem was closing ranks. Nothing official was said. No threats were made. But small things began to change. Familiar faces stopped smiling. Conversations ended when Helen's name came up. People who once returned her calls suddenly forgot her number. It was subtle, almost polite. And that's what made it unsettling. Harlem didn't shout. It watched. Bumpy stayed silent too. He didn't send for her. He didn't explain. That absence hurt more than anger would have. For the first time since she'd met him, Helen felt outside the circle. And she hated it. She convinced herself that she just needed to remind Bumpy of what they shared. The late-night talks. The laughter. The way he listened to her like she mattered. So she dressed carefully, chose her words in advance, and headed back uptown, telling herself this was still her story to control. The streets looked the same, but they felt different. Eyes lingered a little longer. Faces were harder to read. When she reached the club where she and Bumpy used to sit together, the music was loud, the line was long, and the door stood firmly closed. Helen stepped forward, expecting recognition. Instead, she was met with a look that passed right through her, as if she wasn't there at all. No argument, no explanation, just a quiet refusal. And in that moment, standing under the glow of a Harlem streetlight, Helen began to realize that whatever Helen Johnson had whispered right away that night. It was she stood across the street from the club, watching people go in and out, listening to the laughter and music she used to be part of. It wasn't just the closed door that unsettled her. It was the way no one met her eyes. The street felt colder, unfamiliar, like a place that no longer recognized her. For the first time since she discovered Harlem, she felt like a stranger instead of an explorer. Inside that same club, Bumpy Johnson sat in his usual place, calm on the surface, restless underneath. He didn't ask about Helen, but that didn't mean he wasn't thinking about her. He understood exactly what had started the moment she disrespected Mame. In his world, love affairs could be forgiven. Public humiliation could not. Every man watching him now was measuring his response, judging whether he still controlled his house. Bumpy knew that if he hesitated too long, the streets would decide for him. Mame, on the other hand, said very little. She returned to her routines as if nothing had changed, hosting dinners, handling quiet business, listening more than she spoke. But people noticed how Harlem leaned toward her. Women who once whispered now nodded with respect. Men lowered their voices around her. They understood something Helen never had, that Mame wasn't reacting out of jealousy. She was protecting order. Helen spent the next few days in a fog of anger and denial. She told friends exaggerated versions of the gala, painting herself as amused, unbothered.
The room looks
but alone,
magnificent tonight.
the
Yes,
fear
and the
crept
music
in.
is perfect.
She began
Shall
to
we
notice
dance?
strange pauses when she walked into rooms. A taxi driver who suddenly refused to take her uptown. An editor who gently suggested she take a break from Harlem stories for a while. No one explained why. They didn't have to. She tried reaching Bumpy again, sending messages through people who once happily carried them. None came back. It was as if her name had been quietly crossed off a list. That silence gnawed at her pride. Helen had built her life on access, on being welcomed into spaces where she didn't technically belong. Now the doors weren't slamming. They were simply disappearing. From another angle, Harlem itself was watching. Barbers talked in low voices. Club owners paid closer attention. Everyone sensed a shift, a tightening of the air. This wasn't about romance anymore. It was about boundaries. About what happens when someone mistakes curiosity for ownership. Helen had walked into a world that ran on unwritten rules and had broken the most important one. Bumpy began receiving subtle reminders of his responsibilities. Old allies stopped by just to check in. Conversations drifted toward loyalty, tradition, respect. No one mentioned Helen directly, but her shadow was everywhere. Bumpy listened, nodding slowly, understanding the message. Harlem didn't care about explanations. It cared about balance. Meanwhile, Helen grew more desperate to reclaim control. She convinced herself that writing was still her weapon, that if she could just get the story out first, she could flip the power back in her favor. But every time she sat down to type, her hands hesitated. The confidence she once wore so easily now felt thin. She was starting to realize that some stories pushed back. As days passed, the distance between her world and Harlem widened. The excitement that once drew her north now felt like a warning she'd ignored too long. And somewhere deep inside, she began to understand the truth she had laughed at before, that in Bumpy Johnson's world, attention could turn into isolation without a single word being spoken. The tension wasn't exploding. It was tightening, quietly, patiently, and Helen was standing right in the middle of it, unsure which way to run, and unaware of how little time she had left to choose. By the end of that week, Helen could feel it in her bones that something was closing in, not in a dramatic way. No threats, no shadows following her, just a steady sense that the world she'd been moving through so confidently was shrinking. Harlem no longer welcomed her curiosity. Downtown no longer found her stories exciting. She was suspended between two places, belonging to neither, and that frightened her more than danger ever had. She tried one last time to reach Bumpy indirectly, stopping by a small jazz lounge where she knew one of his associates sometimes played cards in the back. The music was warm, the room crowded, but the moment she stepped inside, conversation dipped. Someone quietly shook their head. Someone else turned their chair away. No one told her to leave. They didn't need to. The message was clear. You're not part of this anymore. Outside, the city felt louder than usual. Horns blaring, footsteps rushing. Helen realized how exposed she suddenly felt without the invisible shield she thought Bumpy provided. For months, she mistaken proximity for protection. She was beginning to understand the difference. At home, she barely slept. She reread her notes, the details she collected, the stories she thought gave her leverage. But now they felt dangerous to even possess. Names carried weight. Places had memories. And memories, she was learning, could reach back. She locked her door twice. Then a third time, annoyed at herself with a nervous habit, but unable to stop. Across town, Bumpy Johnson sat quietly, listening more than speaking. People came and went, each one carrying pieces of the same unspoken question. He felt the pressure building, not from threats, but from expectation. Harlem had given him loyalty. In return, it demanded clarity. He knew that doing nothing for too long could be read as weakness. And weakness was something Harlem never forgave. Mame noticed a change in him. She didn't push. She didn't ask questions. She simply stayed steady, her presence grounding, reminding him of the line between impulse and consequence. She had already made her move. Now the pieces were shifting on their own. Helen sensed it too, though she couldn't name it. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls went unanswered. Even the thrill seekers who once begged for her Harlem stories now avoided the topic altogether. It was as if someone had quietly decided she was no longer interesting, or worse, no longer safe to be around. One evening, she stepped out onto her apartment balcony and looked toward the dark line of the city stretching north. Harlem was just lights from here, distant and quiet. She told herself she'd walk away, focus on safer stories, let the whole thing fade. But the thought of being erased, of losing control of the narrative, burned hotter than fear. The next day, a small thing happened that changed everything. A note left with her doorman. No name, no message, just a time and a place in Harlem she recognized instantly. A neutral spot, public, carefully chosen. It wasn't an invitation. It was a test. Helen stared at the paper for a long time. Her heart raced. This was what she'd wanted, wasn't it? A chance to speak, to explain, to reclaim something she'd lost. But as she folded the note and slipped it into her coat, a question finally surfaced that she had avoided for too long. Was this her way back in, or her last warning to turn around? As night fell and the city lights flickered on, Helen made her decision. And somewhere in Harlem, the air grew heavy again. as if the streets themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see who would blink first. Helen arrived early. The place name on the note was a small, quiet cafe on the edge of Harlem, the kind that survived by staying neutral. No loud music, no crowds, just coffee, checkered floors, and people who knew how to mind their business. That alone unsettled her. Harlem was never neutral. If this place was still standing, it was because powerful people allowed it to be. She took a seat near the window, back straight, hands folded, trying to look calm. Every time the door opened, her chest tightened. She expected Bumpy. She expected confrontation. What she didn't expect was how long she was left waiting. Minutes passed, then more. The silence felt deliberate, like someone wanted her to sit with her thoughts a little longer. Across the room, two men played cards without speaking. The waitress refilled Helen's cup without asking, never meeting her eyes. Helen began to understand the second twist in her situation. This meeting wasn't about conversation. It was about control, about reminding her who decided when things began and when they ended. When the door finally opened again, it wasn't Bumpy who walked in. It was someone else. A man Helen recognized only vaguely from late nights and back rooms. One of Bumpy's people, but not close enough to be friendly. He didn't sit down. He didn't introduce himself. He simply placed an envelope on the table and left without a word. Helen stared at it, heart pounding. The envelope wasn't sealed. Inside were copies of her own notes, names she'd written, places she'd visited, conversations she thought were private. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a threat written in ink. It was a mirror showing her just how exposed she really was. She realized then that the power dynamic had shifted again. This wasn't about silencing her voice. It was about proving that her voice was already known, already heard, and already accounted for. Whatever she wrote next wouldn't shock anyone. It would only confirm what they already expected from her. Back in his world, Bumpy Johnson listened as the report came in. No drama, no raised voices, just confirmation that Helen had received the message. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. This wasn't easy for him, no matter how calm he looked. He wasn't cruel by nature, but he understood consequences. And once something threatened the balance of Harlem, it had to be contained. Mame sat nearby, sewing quietly, her posture relaxed. She didn't ask what was in the envelope. She didn't need to. Her concern wasn't Helen anymore. It was what came next. Because when fear replaces confidence, people do unpredictable things. And Helen was running out of good options. Helen left the cafe shaken, but unharmed. That scared her more than if someone had shouted or grabbed her. She walked the streets slowly, noticing details she'd ignored before. The way people watched from doorways, the way conversations stopped when strangers passed. Harlem wasn't chasing her. It was simply aware of her. That night, another twist unfolded. Helen received a call from downtown. An editor, calm voice, careful words. He told her the magazine was reconsidering its direction. Too risky, too controversial. Harlem stories weren't the priority anymore. He suggested she take time off, focus on lighter pieces, travel writing, maybe. The message hit harder than any warning. Her career, the thing she thought protected her, was slipping through her fingers, not because of scandal, because of quiet influence. Doors were closing on both sides now. Helen began to panic. She considered leaving the city altogether, packing a suitcase and disappearing before anything else happened. But pride held her back. She wanted answers. She wanted to face Bumpy. She wanted to believe she still mattered in this story. What she didn't know was that Harlem was already moving past her. The conversation was no longer about what she might do. It was about how much damage she could cause if she acted out of fear. And that made her unpredictable. As another night fell, Helen stood by her window again, city lights blinking below. She felt smaller than she ever had, caught between powerful forces she no longer understood. Somewhere uptown, Bumpy Johnson weighed patience against action. Somewhere nearby, Mame Johnson remained steady, watching the board like a seasoned chess player. And in the space between silence and decision, the tension tightened one last notch, setting the stage for a final confrontation that no one could walk away from unchanged. Helen didn't sleep that night. By morning, her fear had hardened into resolve. Running had cost her everything already: her access, her reputation, her sense of control. What was left to lose? She dressed plainly: no silk, no perfume, no performance. For the first time since stepping into Harlem, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was trying to survive. The message came just after noon. This time it was clear. Bumpy Johnson would see her. One meeting, one chance. Neutral ground again, but closer to his territory. Helen knew what that meant. This wasn't about romance anymore. It was about endings. When she arrived, Bumpy was already there, seated calmly, hands folded, eyes steady. No anger, no warmth, just authority. The room felt smaller with a minute. Helen understood in that moment how foolish she'd been, mistaking attention for affection, curiosity for power. She spoke first, her voice controlled but thin. She tried to explain, to justify, to remind him of their conversations, their connection, the way he once listened. Bumpy let her finish. Then he spoke quietly, each word measured. He told her she had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. Not because she was an outsider, not because she was a woman, but because she had shown disrespect where respect was sacred. He explained Harlem wasn't a story to be collected. It was a home people bled for, and Mame was part of that foundation. Helen finally understood the true cost of her mistake. This wasn't about jealousy. It was about order, and she had threatened it. She braced herself for what she thought would come next. A demand, a warning, something dark. Instead, Bumpy surprised her. He told her she would walk away. No articles, no expose, no retaliation. Harlem didn't need to destroy her to prove a point. Silence would do the job better. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived, because then Bumpy delivered the real consequence. He told her she was finished not because of him, but because of herself. The doors she relied on were already closed. The people who once admired her now saw her as a liability, and Harlem wouldn't speak her name again. Helen left the meeting shaken, but alive. She packed her things within days. No farewell parties, no headlines, just a quiet exit from New York. Her career fading not with scandal, but with absence. For a long time, people downtown wondered why her voice disappeared. No one ever got a clear answer. Harlem moved on. It always did. The music kept playing. The streets kept breathing. And Bumpy Johnson's name remained exactly where it had always been. Powerful, controlled, unquestioned. But the final twist didn't belong to Helen or Bumpy. It belonged to Mame. Months later, a short piece appeared in print. Not an expose, not an attack. A simple cultural essay about Harlem. Its resilience, its women, its unspoken rules. It was careful, respectful, and it painted a picture of strength few outsiders had ever captured. The byline wasn't Helen's. It was anonymous. Those who knew understood. Mame hadn't just protected her world. She had rewritten the ending. She let Helen leave with her life, but not her narrative. Because in Harlem, the greatest power isn't who speaks the loudest. It's who decides which stories get told, and which ones disappear forever. Time passed, the way it always does in Harlem. Quietly on the surface, loudly underneath, the club stayed open late. The music kept spilling into the streets, and people kept finding ways to survive. To anyone looking from the outside, nothing had changed. But inside the neighborhood, the lesson had settled deep. Everyone knew what had happened, even if no one spoke Helen's name out loud. Silence had done its work. Bumpy Johnson returned fully to his routines. Meetings, deals, late nights that never quite felt late to him. The brief distraction that had threatened his balance faded into memory, replaced by the steady rhythm of control. Some men might have carried guilt or regret. Bumpy carried clarity. He understood now, more than ever, that power was fragile when mixed with ego. Harlem didn't need him to be reckless. It needed him to be steady. Mame Johnson remained exactly where she had always been, beside him, but never behind him. People spoke of her with renewed respect, especially the women. They saw in her a quiet strength that didn't rely on shouting or spectacle. She hadn't fought for attention. She had waited, chosen her moment, and spoken just enough. In a world where loudness often passed for authority, Mame proved that restraint could be sharper than any weapon. As for Helen, her life unfolded far from Harlem. She traveled. She wrote smaller pieces under different names. Some were published. Many weren't. She never again came close to the influence she once enjoyed. Friends noticed she avoided stories about power, about crime, about places where rules weren't written down. When Harlem came up in conversation, she changed the subject. The city had taken something from her she couldn't replace, the illusion that she was untouchable. Every now and then, someone would ask what really happened between her and Bumpy Johnson, why she vanished so suddenly, why no big story ever came out. There were theories, some dramatic, some exaggerated, but the truth was simpler and far more unsettling. She hadn't been punished loudly. She had been dismissed. And for someone who lived to be seen, that was the harshest ending possible. The anonymous article continued to circulate quietly. Readers felt its honesty without knowing its source. It spoke of Harlem not as a playground or a battlefield, but as a living place shaped by dignity, pain, and pride. It centered women, their patience, their intelligence, their unseen labor. Those who knew Mame recognized her voice instantly. Those who didn't simply felt its weight. Bumpy never acknowledged the article publicly. He didn't need to. The message had already landed. Harlem's story would be told by those who lived it, not those who visited. Outsiders could listen, learn, and leave, but never claim ownership. Years later, when people spoke about Bumpy Johnson's legacy, they mentioned his mind, his generosity, his control of the streets. But among those who truly understood Harlem, there was always an unspoken addition to the story. A reminder that his greatest strength wasn't just how he ruled, but who stood beside him. Mame wasn't a footnote in his life. She was the balance that kept everything from tipping into chaos. The affair faded into rumor. The gala became legend. The whisper turned into myth. But the lesson stayed sharp. Respect wasn't optional. And intelligence without humility was a liability. Harlem remembered. It always did. And long after the music changed and the faces on the streets grew younger, the story lingered, not as gossip, but as warning, a reminder that some power doesn't announce itself. It waits, it watches, and when the moment comes, it speaks softly and changes everything. That was the real ending. Not revenge, not violence, just a quiet, permanent shift. In the world of Bumpy Johnson, the sharpest move wasn't striking back. It was knowing when to close the door and never open it again.